Good. All right. How's everyone doing today? Good? Yes, thank you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started because I recognize that I am the last speaker of the day and I am the one person standing between you and your drink. So I will not keep you a minute longer. Hello, my name is Claire Brody. I am thrilled to be here today to speak with you all. And my topic for the next 50 minutes or so is going to be about design thinking and how you should be using it when you're developing your KM strategy and roadmaps. So a little bit about me. Like several of my colleagues that you've heard from today, I work at Enterprise Knowledge. I'm a senior analyst. A lot of my work there is around that KM strategy space. I've done strategies for organizations both large and small, simple and complex. But I also do a lot of work in taxonomy design and have some skill sets in the UX, UI space, as well as a tiny little bit of front-end coding skills and visual design. Outside of work, I am a volunteer and a member of the board of the local OpenIDEO DC chapter. And so OpenIDEO is an online platform that crowdsources innovative ideas to solve some of the nation's and frankly the world's most challenging problems. And through that, I somehow ended up managing their knowledge management efforts. I really don't know how they picked me. But in addition to that, I do a lot of volunteer facilitation through that group. And so with that said, because I'm used to facilitating these workshops and I use a lot of sticky notes, a lot of markers, I'm going to cover a lot of material in the next hour or so. And so I'm going to ask you all to imagine yourself doing the activities that I'm describing and picturing how you can take some of these things back to your organization and apply them in your day-to-day work. Sound okay? All right, so before we dive a little bit deeper, just want to give a quick overview of what I hope to accomplish today with you all. First and foremost, most importantly, giving you that overview of design thinking. What is it? Why is it becoming, I think, more and more prominent in our work as KM practitioners? From there, why design thinking? Why should we care as KM practitioners about using design thinking in our work? From there, I'll be going through a greater detail of the design thinking process, going through the 5 phases and sharing some best practices and approaches, also some lessons learned and anticipated outcomes for each phase. And from there, I'll share our own workshop approach and how we leverage design thinking to do a one-day workshop where we help an organization design their KM strategy. And close with a few case studies because, like a lot of things in KM, it's very easy to talk about something, to think about it, but not actually do it. And so I really want to share some case studies that showcase how we're applying this in our day-to-day work. And obviously leave time for Q&A. Now, before I dive any deeper, I do want to point out 2 things. Like I said, I'm going to be covering a lot of material and moving pretty quickly. So things can get jargony. If something doesn't make sense, please call me out on it and ask clarifying questions. And also, you'll notice I have my Twitter handle in the bottom right as well as my company's. Please tweet at me. I love this stuff. And any opportunity that I have to further engage you all in conversation is awesome in my book. All right, so first of all, really quick definition of design thinking. It's a human-centered approach to problem solving that brings together the needs of your business, but also technological needs as well. And I really enjoy this picture because it encapsulates what we deal with on a day-to-day basis in KM. We're thinking about hundreds of things. We're thinking about processes and technologies and systems and our C-level executives and those business stakeholders that are saying, we need X, how can you help us get there? But frankly, for the next hour or so, I don't want you guys to care about any of that. I don't want any of you to care about that as much as you care about this guy right here. Design thinking at its core is humans at the center. And the moment that you forget about your end users in any sort of KM initiative is when you've failed before you've even started. So has anyone in the room used this ketchup bottle on the left? Raise your hand. Can one of you describe that experience for me? How did you get the ketchup out of the bottle? With a knife. Flipping it over, going like, why can't I get this? What about this ketchup bottle on the left? Anyone use that before? What is it like? Squeeze it. Simple, easy. I love this graphic, and not because I love ketchup, although I do, but because it truly encapsulates why design thinking matters and why it's important. And I think the lessons learned from this directly correspond to lessons that we should be hearing in KM. First, assuming that we know what the user wants. KM is rife with assumptions. We are notorious and unfortunately associated with not doing enough user engagement. And we assume that that user wants that shiny new toy, that brand new search, or that brand new CMS. But just like this ketchup bottle, it looks sleek. It looks like a nice product, but it's not usable. And so you can see why it transitioned to that graphic on the right. To that end, KM is such an academic field, and we often find ourselves telling end users what they need rather than listening to their pain points and to their goals. And we think that just because something is a good design, like a website is sleek, it's smooth, it's easy, it looks sharp, that it's going to address those end user needs. Now, this image on the right, though, it focuses on the end user. It challenges any assumptions that we may have about that end user. Yeah, that bottle looks clunky, not as sleek as the one on the left, but it's usable. It leverages collective expertise. So designers who made that bottle definitely talked to the people who used it. So when I talk about leveraging collective expertise moving forward, I'm talking about two threads. One, I'm talking about leveraging the collective expertise of your team. So myself as a consultant versus my colleague James, who is a developer, we're going to come at these problem-solving techniques differently, and that is amazing. Likewise, you should be leveraging the collective expertise of your users. And so we at EK are, bless you, we at EK really focus on making sure we get a holistic representation of our user base. And so say I'm designing a taxonomy. I want to talk to that person who is starting on her very first day at the company and make sure that those categories are just as intuitive to her as it is for someone who's been in the company for 40 years. Employing empathy. How many of you can say confidently that you actually care about your end users? All right, more hands need to be up in the future, because if we don't, we have a problem. And I'll run the risk of being a little touchy-feely here and say that you need empathy to do KM well. You need to truly feel for your end users' pain points, their frustrations, and you need to cheer with your end users when they say, yes, I've accomplished this goal. Without that, frankly, your KM efforts are not going to do as well. And finally, constant iteration. I think KM is also associated with building out these glorious systems or these glorious solutions and going through all that time and effort and using all those resources only to find that it's not what the user needs. And so design thinking uses that constant iteration, that agile approach to make sure that you're building something that aligns with the end user's needs all along the way. Now, this looks a little complex, but I'm going to break it down to you in 2 to 3 points. But to start, these 5 phases across the slide are the ones I'm going to go into greater detail later. So don't feel like you need to memorize them at this point. I will go into each of those. Today, I'm going to be talking about design thinking in a linear fashion. I'm going to be going from empathize to define to ideate all the way across. In reality, design thinking is not like that. It's a non-linear practice. You can be doing 2 phases simultaneously. You could be going back and forth between a different phase. And so, for example, maybe you're at that testing phase where you're engaging with the end users and you're giving them a solution and saying, hey, play with this. How does it work? And maybe through that process, you realize we need to redefine our problem. We're trying to solve for that wrong problem. So in that case, you go right back to that define stage, and that is okay. The last point I want to make before moving forward is that design thinking, as I said before, can be done in a 1-day workshop, It could be a series of exercises that you do over a month, 3 months. But it can also be the framework within which you structure your design efforts. And so the point I want to make here is that design thinking isn't something that can just be done in isolation. It can scale. And to that end, you've probably heard some of my colleagues today talk about Agile. And that's a huge part of our work at EK. But we recognize that Agile doesn't always work for organizations. Your organization may not be there yet, and that's okay. The beauty of design thinking is that it can work in both Agile project management and waterfall project management. In Agile, design thinking gives you that framework to collect that iterative, constant feedback from your end users. Whereas in the waterfall project management style, design thinking can give you and your team that structure to really frame out what does design the solution even mean. It gives you that framework within which to operate. So a couple high-level points about why, again, design thinking should be used by KM practitioners. You know, KM is notorious for that lack of buy-in, that lack of alignment from end users. And that can be for any number of reasons. It could be because KM can be abstract. It can be too jargony. It can really be difficult to tie it to business value. It could be because people don't want to change. Change is hard. And the beauty of design thinking is that it gives you and your team a framework to make KM real, to make KM tangible for your end users. And it allows you to design those solutions both with your end users and for them. All right, so that was a quick overview about design thinking, and now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the 5 phases. So first is empathize. And so again, KM is rife with assumptions. We don't engage enough with our end users. The empathize stage directly counteracts that challenge that we have as KM practitioners. It's the phase in which you are working really hard to truly understand your end users within the context of these KM challenges. It is not only listening to their pain points, but also listening to their goals, their motivations, what is keeping them up at night, what is meaningful to them. And so it's gaining that holistic experience through observing them, engaging with them, and truly immersing yourself in their experience. So what does that look like? The beauty of design thinking is that there are any number of approaches you can take within these phases. And so for each of these slides, I'll point out some of my favorites, and then those best practices and tips. Interviews and focus groups. I'm sure everyone in this room has done at least one of these before, right? Make sense? These are great. It's a very easy, kind of low-hanging fruit to do, interviews and focus groups with your end users. How many of you have been part of an interview or focus group, though, where it's been boring? I have, and it's not fun. So, you know, at EK, we try to make these as interactive as possible, and I would encourage you guys all to do the same. So doing a mix of breakout group sessions and collective group conversations, using sticky notes and markers and active listening, things like that. But I would encourage you to move beyond just interviews and focus groups in your Empathize work. How many of you have used user personas before? Good, awesome. User personas are a great way to visualize who you're designing for. So giving you and your team an individual with clear frustrations, clear goals, that person around which to design. So if we are designing a solution for Nancy Jones, we need to make sure throughout this entire process that whatever solution we design is going to work for Nancy. Another approach that I really enjoy personally is observations and immersions. My colleague and I just finished up a KM strategy project for a service desk team. And so what we did was we went on site to that client, and we observed that service desk team in their natural environment. We observed them answering calls and trying to find their information and all of that good stuff. And frankly, it gave us a deeper level of insight that I don't think we would have gotten had we just done interviews and focus groups. Now, some best practices and tips here. I'd say the most important here is assuming a beginner's mindset. You need to abandon whatever KM ego you have at the door, abandon any of that KM jargon, because frankly, your end users are not going to care about that, most likely. So always asking, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? How are you doing this? And assuming that you don't know, because if you go in with an assumption that you already know they need search, you're automatically creating a blind spot for yourself that will force you to miss other opportunities to solution for them. And again, as I said, make these interactions as active and interactive as possible. That, engaging your users and helping them have fun is going to allow you to get a lot greater insight than you would otherwise. So some outcomes. Most importantly, you and your team have a clear understanding of that end user and their frustrations, their pain points, motivations, goals, all of that good stuff. But I would say to that end, you also achieve alignment within your team. How many times have you and your team had a conversation about, well, we've got this need and this need and this goal, and it's hard to come together as a group? Doing this user research and creating personas and getting that empathizing work done helps you and your team align around, yes, these are the pain points we're hearing, and this is how we're going to move forward. And so I want to point out this example here real quick. This is a persona that we created as part of our work with the National Park Service. And so any of you who listened to my colleague Zach earlier this morning know that we built a common learning portal for park rangers so that they could access information at any point of the day, wherever they were across the country and around the world. And so they designed this persona for a woman named Maria, who was a brand new employee in the Park Service, 1 year in. She was very technically savvy, and she had these expectations for the site. And so the beauty of personas is that you can tweak them to capture the information you need to know going forward. So in this case, we needed to know how technically savvy Maria was. What did she want to get out of the CLP? And so that gave us that guidance to move forward and say, all right, let's look back at Maria's needs. Are we addressing them? Do we need to course correct? And things like that. Okay, so that was phase one. We're moving on to phase two, which frankly is my favorite, and this is defining. And so picture that empathy work as a giant funnel. And this is the phase where you're narrowing that all down to a clear challenge statement. And so I want to emphasize here that defining is not when you're solutioning. This is when you are focusing on that challenge statement that you and your team can align around and say, okay, we've identified this need, let's move forward with this. And so I love this point because it is truly your responsibility to define that challenge. And I think especially as KM practitioners, we are constantly told to do more with less and less with less. And so it's incredibly important for us to be strategic and prioritize what is the most critical need we need to address first. And so again, there are a number of ways you can go about this, and some of which I'll point out as my favorites. And so you'll notice this image right here. So when I'm doing these workshops, there's a lot of sticky notes. So many sticky notes. So if you don't like sticky notes, you really probably shouldn't be here right now. But so when we're doing this, we are active listening to our colleagues and hearing those thoughts during the empathizing work, and we're jotting them down. And usually it ends up where we've got a lot of sticky notes, and we're faced with the challenge of how do we make sense of this? And so one of my favorite approaches here is theming, and it sounds exactly as it is. You're moving those sticky notes around into buckets and giving those buckets a name. And so maybe I'm working in a challenge with diversity in tech. And so maybe one of the themes I'm hearing is, oh, I don't have a mentor, or oh, I don't have someone to teach me how to do X. And so maybe I'm moving those sticky notes into a bucket that's mentorship. And so what this does for you is it helps you start to make sense of the myriad of information that you're hearing, and gives you a place to start moving towards those how might we or challenge statements. And so in design thinking, you're going to hear a lot about a how might we statement. And what this is a structure for defining your challenge. It's saying, how might we blank? And it's very purposeful that it's a question. We want to keep these statements broad enough that there could be any number of solutions that could come about, but not so broad that we can't manage it. So I think a more common phrase here is challenge statement. So basically finding that statement that you and your team can align around and say, okay, we're going to design for this. We're going to ideate and prototype around this challenge statement. And some best practices here. First of all, I'll say that this is a really difficult process. When we've done these workshops with National Park Service, you can imagine, these are some of the most passionate people in the world. They love their parks, they love what they do. And so it's very difficult for them to take a step back and be objective in defining what are those challenges and how do we prioritize. That is so critical before you move forward. If you don't define a clear challenge statement, the subsequent steps around brainstorming and prototyping and testing, they go all over the place. And you end up with the same problem that many of us face as KM practitioners, that we're trying to do everything, and as a result, we're not doing anything. And so what I'll say here is, again, don't underestimate the power of prioritization. You can always come back to things, I promise, but being very strategic will help you further this process down the road. And so again, some outcomes here. Having that clear scope and having those prioritized needs that say, yes, as a team, we understand that we're going to address this problem first, and then maybe we'll get to these other challenges later. And having that focused challenge statement can help your team align and have a clear direction for moving forward. And I will say real quick that prioritization can take any shape or form. It really depends on your organization. It depends on your team. And so we realized when we were first doing these workshops with Park Service, again, that it was very difficult to be objective. And so at first we were letting people kind of vote willy-nilly and do their own thing, and then we realized it's hard to step back when you don't have a structure by which to do so. And so we did a very simple one where it was like, how simple is this going to be? How much value is it going to bring to the Park Service? And something as easy as that actually went a long way in helping people be more objective. Okay. So moving on to ideating. Ideating is another word for brainstorming. It's this mentally a process of going wide and generating as many ideas as possible. Now this ties back to CAM in that a lot of times when we think of knowledge management, we think of a technological solution, right? So this phase directly counteracts that in the fact that you're brainstorming any number of solutions, whether they be technological, whether they be related to people or culture or process. And so it directly counteracts that notion that CAM always has to be technology. So some of my favorite approaches here, I'm going to point out two: silent brainstorming and gut checks. And so silent brainstorming, exactly as it sounds. You are, as a team, working individually and jotting down one idea per sticky and just getting as many ideas out as possible. Gut checks happen afterwards. And so picture you have a wall of stickies on the board like these guys do right here. You're taking a look at some of those more promising ideas and asking yourselves and your team, all right, what are some of the barriers here? What are things that we should be cognizant about before we move forward with this idea? And I really appreciate this because it forces us to look back at reality. I think design thinking is already kind of getting a rap as a little more fluffy, and this is a way to bring your feet back down to earth and say, okay, what's the reality in which we're working? Now, I do want to spend a little more time here on best practices just because I think this phase can get a little dicey, and I'll explain why. Brainstorming implies this very free form and creative process, and that is absolutely true. But at the same time, you need that structure. You need to give your team and your end users that structure that says, okay, here's the scope in which we're brainstorming. Here's a time box within which you are ideating. Here are some ground rules to make sure that no one's ideas are getting squashed. And so I'll say here that it's super important to have a facilitator, ideally outside your organization, but at very least outside your team, to facilitate that process, make sure that stronger personalities aren't dominating the conversation. Another point in terms of structure is offer activities that cater to both introverts and extroverts. Shockingly enough, I am actually an introvert. And so I love silent brainstorming. It allows me to kind of get in my zone, do my thing, and I don't have to worry about other people's perspectives. That being said, that doesn't work for everyone. And so doing something like role play or gut checks or working as a team allows you to balance the needs of all of your team members. And that's super important because if you're only catering to one half of your team members, you're losing all those other great potential ideas that you would otherwise capture. Now I would say, and then I would close this part with saying, always, always quantity over quality here. You never know if an idea that you think of randomly off the top of your head is going to combine with another idea that another teammate thinks of and comes together in something really innovative and cool. So outcomes. I touched on this a little bit, but when you do this right, ideating brings together the strengths and perspectives of your different team members and your end users. And so as I said before, I'm going to come at ideating a different way than, say, my colleague Zach or my colleague Joe or my colleague James or Mary. And so having those different perspectives really allows you to get a holistic representation of all the ideas that are possibly out there. And having that large volume of ideas gives you plenty of material with which to move forward into prototyping and testing. Okay, so moving on to prototyping. Now you've gathered all your ideas and you've found some promising ones that could be really cool. Prototyping is essential in design thinking, and I think it has a lot of benefit for the people who work in KM as well, because how many times have we heard someone go through the whole process of creating this amazing system, this amazing solution, just to find out that it isn't what the user needs? That is literally why we get calls practically every day. So prototyping is that idea that you're iteratively generating artifacts that your user can interact with. And so this could be any number of things. When I say artifact, say you're designing a website. Artifact could be a wireframe. If you're designing an experience, maybe you're designing a journey map or a storyboard that shows how that user is progressing through the experience. And so the idea here is that you want to answer questions that you have from that ideate phase about, okay, we have this idea, we have this question that we need an end user to answer. And so I'll say here before I move forward that this is an excellent point at which to bring those end users in, if you haven't since you started, to get their feedback and work on that change management and buy-in from your end users. And that creates a strong army of people who say, I've been involved in this process from the very start. I care about this. I've helped design this. I am going to protect this with everything I've got. So again, plenty of ways you can go about this. Some of my favorites that I use commonly are journey maps and wireframes. And so you can't tell, but this is a journey map from when I first started. And so I now know where things are, and I know what I'm doing, which is excellent. But this was used when we were redesigning our KM intranet and identifying, all right, where are the weak points in our experience that we need to work on? Another thing that we use are those wireframes. So again, we do a lot of work with taxonomy design. And so we do wireframes to showcase, all right, how is that taxonomy going to work on your system? But how is that going to help you improve your search, improve your ability to find things at that point of need? And so both of these things that I just gave you are low cost, easy to design, easy to hand to a user and say, hey, we've got this idea. What do you think? Tell me how you feel. Give me your feedback. And you ensure that you're not designing something that a user doesn't need or doesn't want. And you're giving them something tangible, something real that says, hey, I may not know what a taxonomy is dictionary-wise, but I know what it does for me. And I care about this now. And so how many times have we heard as KM practitioners that we've tried KM before, we don't need it? I've heard that way too many times. The truth is everyone needs it, and prototyping gives us a way to show end users, hey, this is what KM can do for you. This is why you need it and why you should care. Now some best practices and tips here. There are so many things that you could test out in a prototype. The goal here is to be strategic again. So again, we go back to that idea that there could be an experience that you're trying to test out. There could be a layout of a website that you're trying to test out. You can't test everything. So prioritize the biggest questions that you have and decide on a prototyping method that'll help you get those answers. Make sense? And so there are two ways to go about this here. I think probably a lot of you have heard of minimum viable product, MVP, right? So great example of how design thinking and KM really fit nicely together. You want to design that MVP, the minimum viable product with the most basic features that you can say, all right, we're going to get that validation before we go any further so we don't waste anyone's time or anyone's resources. So outcomes, avoiding that feature bloat. So if you design a whole solution with all these amazing features and people only use 2 out of the 10 features, well, that is a pretty big waste of your time, your money, your effort as KM practitioners. And so it, again, allows you to be strategic and think through, all right, what are the biggest questions we have here? What do we need to know? And so this gives you that framework for you and your team to say, all right, let's test this out before we move any further. So I want to point out these examples here real quick, because at EK we do a lot of wireframing, and that's actually one of my favorite things to do. It's surprisingly creative, and I enjoy it. But on the top right is a wireframe that we built out for the World Bank. And so what we were doing at the time was designing an app to be used for a water and sanitation project. And so what we did was we held these workshops where we gathered requirements. We heard from those end users, okay, I would love an app that can do X. And so this wireframe was essentially a compilation of all of those requirements. And so we said, all right, this is what we heard from you. Let's give this to you and say, all right, what do you think? Did we hear you right? Do we need to adjust? And this gave us a very quick way to validate, okay, you got this part right. You were so far off base with this, I don't know where you got it from, but it helped, and it was a quick and clear way to do that. Now this one on the bottom right is a wireframe that we did for Pearson when we were designing a taxonomy. And so I'll add that, so as I said before, prototypes can help you answer questions, but again, they can help make KM real. And so our clients here, they kind of knew what a taxonomy was, but they couldn't visualize it. And so this gave us a really clear way to say, look, here's all of your content, all of your sales content. That's what we were designing for. Here are the categories that you will be able to filter by to get down to the information that you need. And so it allowed the user to say, oh, I'll be able to filter by audience? I've never been able to do that before. Or, oh, I can filter by topic? Wow, before that I had to go through a giant list of links. And so it gave that visceral, clear reaction from the end user that said, I need this. I will not be able to do my job without this. And so it helped with that, again, that buy-in, that alignment with your end users to say, yes, we are on the same page. All right, last phase, promise. So you've built out your prototype. You've decided what questions you need to ask your end users. Now comes the time to test. And so again, this is an opportunity to re-engage with those end users and gain empathy for how they interact with this. And so you're soliciting feedback, you're re-understanding your end user, because most likely, yes, you've engaged your user throughout this process, but things change constantly. And so having that opportunity to re-engage, re-evaluate what you've heard and adjust is a great opportunity here. So again, many ways that you can go about this. We do a lot of observing. So if we're talking about UX, that might be a first click test. So having a user look at a mock-up of a website and say, all right, I need you to go find this. And so watching that user traverse the website and say, oh, I think it might be here, or oh, it might actually be here. If we see a user bouncing around like that, then we know it's either the layout, it's the categories, something's not clicking, and we need to fix that. Guerrilla testing is actually really fun, although it can be intimidating. It's when you find someone on the fly in a coffee shop, off the street, maybe in like your organization's cafeteria, and you say, hey, look at this. Your thoughts. And having that split-second decision to immediately evaluate a prototype, you get some really authentic responses. And you know, with all of these types of engagements, it really depends on your team. Again, it depends on your team, it depends on your organization. So thinking about what method will work best for you. Now, I really, at this point when I'm facilitating these workshops, I like to take a deeper dive into feedback, because kind of similar to ideating, if you don't have a structure for feedback, it's pretty meaningless and it doesn't help you. And so a big tip here is ask for the problem, but do not ask for the solution. Your user doesn't know. So again, going back to that first click test, and you see a user messing around and not being able to find what you're asking them to find. They don't know, and you don't know yet if it's because of the layout of the website, if it's because of the colors of the buttons, if it's because of the labels on those buttons. They don't know. And it's not fair of you to ask them to make that decision on the fly. And to that end, you should be asking for examples. So, all right, show me where you got stuck. Why was this confusing to you? Gathering that feedback, asking questions. Feedback should be a conversation. It's a two-way street. And if it's very one-sided, then you're not getting that holistic picture that you need in order to iterate and make this better. Another big point here is mistakes are still progress. We hear a lot in KM about best practices, but I really liked something I heard this morning. A best practice is not your organization's best practice, and that is super important to hear. A best practice that you see online in a white paper, it's great. It's a great guideline by which to say, all right, this is something we want to strive for. But a best practice does not reflect the nuances within your organization. It doesn't reflect your team. It doesn't reflect your end users. And so any and all mistakes that you make, as they are going to happen, I'm sorry to tell you, you will make mistakes. Those documented course corrections and lessons learned can truly inform those future iterations, and they're going to be tailored to you. And that is incredibly powerful, if not more than best practices. Outcomes here. Fast and immediate feedback, that is so critical. Again, at EK, we talk about working in an agile way. Doing constant iterations and building on what we've learned and how we're iterating that is so critical to doing this in a sustainable manner. We've talked a lot about how in KM we're notorious for building out a whole solution and then realizing half of it isn't what the user needs. And so doing this in an iterative manner, building on those lessons learned and course corrections is really imperative to making sure you do this in a sustainable manner. Okay, so I've talked a lot, and I've run through the design thinking process in a very quick fashion. First of all, before I move forward, are there any questions about what I just talked about? Yeah?
For the ideation phase, you listed out a lot of good ways to do it in person.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any examples of how to do that if your users are in different time zones?
Great question. I love that question. So I was actually thinking about this before the talk, and you called out a point that I'm in the future going to add to these slides, because it's increasingly a reality that we are a disparate workforce, that we're across time zones, across countries. In my personal experience, we've used a tool called Trello. Have you ever used that before? And so for those of you who don't know, Trello is like a project management tool. And a way that you can tweak this to use it for brainstorming is have everyone on, say, like an online meeting and have a column that's labeled ideas. And so things change live as you're adding cards and stuff. So you can use those cards, type in your idea, and just put them in a single column. And then this creates an actual really cool opportunity. As you see ideas that are more promising, you can physically move them up to the top for discussion. So that works if you are, in a, like everyone's on the same page regardless of time zones and they're all on the call. But it can also act as a really good artifact as a backlog of sorts. So you've got all these ideas and you're going to move forward with maybe 2 or 3 of them, but you've still got that reference document that you can go back to and you can say, excuse me. And you can say, oh, so-and-so had that idea. I think, at this point in the project, like we can actually do that. Let's move it forward. Is that, well, that's one example, but I'm sure there are plenty more. Does that help? Great. Other question?
Sorry, do you have an example of a KM strategy defined centered around the users compared to another one?
Yeah, and so I'll get into a couple case studies at the end that I think will showcase how we make sure users are staying at the center. So stay tuned. We'll get that. Does that work? Yeah. All right, so I want to talk really briefly about how we do this at EK. So as I said, we do one-day workshops where we go through this entire process. And so to start, we empathize. We bring together a team, and everyone's active listening via lightning talks, logging on sticky notes, And it culminates in a creation of a user persona. Again, that person around which your team can align and say, all right, we're going to design around for solutions for this person. From there, again, we go to that idea of theming, pulling down those sticky notes, putting them into buckets, identifying those key areas that we want to focus on, and define a challenge statement. And we prioritize those challenges, and we give it a very clear statement around which to say, okay, we are going to ideate around this challenge. Now from there, brainstorming, and again, idea prioritization. And again, moving from there into potential pilots. So taking those ideas, looking at the more promising ones and saying, okay, what are some of the prototypes we could do around this? What are the pilots? And so again, taking those potential pilots, prioritizing and selecting them to move forward. And then finally, we close out by saying, okay, we've selected pilots that we want to test. We're going to create some immediate actions that make sure that this gets off the ground. We're giving owners, we're giving deadlines. And so by the end of this process, not only do you have a KM strategy that you've designed, you have a KM strategy that everyone can unite around. So I want to close out with a few case studies. And first one I'll talk about is a global insurance company that we're working with right now, actually. And so this company came to us, and they said, we need a KM strategy. We've tried this before and failed. It hasn't worked. It's not clicking. And so what we did was we conducted interviews, we conducted focus groups, and again, we went back to those observations and immersing ourselves in that user's experience to identify pain points. And we were very clear here in these interviews and this empathy work that we didn't ask, oh, how is the findability of your content? We asked, what's not working? What are your goals, and how do we think we can use knowledge management to help you? From there, we defined some clear challenge statements around which to brainstorm future activities. And so what this culminated in was a series of 3-month pilot projects within this company. And so we did a pilot project around designing an initial business taxonomy. We did a pilot around designing an online expert finder, so someone in this region of the country could find someone in that region of the country and have that connection. All of these pilots were capped at 3 months, and that's very purposeful because these pilots are feeding into that 2-year roadmap that this organization is going to work through. And so lessons learned from designing that initial business taxonomy are going to feed into an enterprise-wide taxonomy. Lessons learned from designing that expert finder within one business unit are going to help us design an even better expert finder across different business units. You see what I'm getting at here? Now, I will say that the beauty of this situation is that, yes, we developed these pilots, we're testing them right now, and then the best part about all this is that we're going to go right back to prototyping and say, okay, we've done this initial round of prototypes. Let's find that next round and say, all right, we're going to keep iterating, keep expanding these efforts until we get to that KM target state that we want. And I like pointing this out because it really showcases that, again, design thinking is not a linear process. At many points, are you going to be going back from define to ideate to prototype to test and back to test? And that is exactly how it's intended. Now, I will dive deeper very briefly into these 2 images because I think they offer a preview of how we make sure we do our empathy work well. And so I've talked a lot throughout this presentation about how it's really essential to get that holistic representation of your end users. And this matrix up on the top left helps us make sure that we're getting everything that we need and we're not missing any gaps. And so you'll notice we've got senior employees, mid-level employees, and junior-level employees, and then business units across the top. Within each of those boxes, you can see well-tenured employees versus less tenured employees. And so if I look at this matrix, I can see, wow, okay, we are sadly lacking in getting interviews, focus groups, observations done with junior staff members in the HR department. We are missing key representation from senior level staff members in the L&D department. And so this gives us a very quick visual to say, what's missing? Who do we need to talk to next to make sure that we've got every single detail that we need? All right, so I've talked about this client before. If you can't tell, I love these guys. They're amazing. And so Again, we've done a series of strategic planning workshops for the Learning and Development Office within the National Park Service. And so, again, Park Service is a very geographically dispersed organization. You've got rangers at the end of the trail at any point across the country. And especially in the case of L&D, recognizing that they were so dispersed and working in silos, they needed to be very strategic and come together and say, what are our resources, what are our priorities, and how do we be strategic about moving forward in a clear learning and development strategy? And so we've done a series of these workshops across the different career fields within L&D. And so we've done one for the natural resource specialists, so the scientists, the ones doing the research out in the field. We've done one for interpretation and education, those rangers who are the front line interacting with people and saying, all right, this is this tree, or this is this statue. And so what we did here was we started each day with, again, 5-minute lightning talks where people were sharing what are their challenges, what are their goals, what are they working on currently. And as everyone was presenting, people were active listening, logging on sticky notes, gathering that information for future work. And from there, again, we did that theming to drive that challenge identification and use dot voting, a very simple technique to vote, prioritize, and be objective about which efforts we wanted to move forward with. On day 2 and 3, we were working through solutioning and action planning. So the goal of these workshops was to be very tangible and going through, all right, here are our prioritized challenges. How are we going to solution around these? What are the potential range of options that we could use to address these challenges? And so when we would work through a solution to say, oh yeah, I think this could work, then it meant breaking it down into actions over the first month, the first 3 months, 6 months, year, 2 year, whatever timing made sense for that specific career field. Some of these career fields said, maybe just give us the actions for the first year, 3 year, and 5 years. Others were, no, we have the resources to do this now. I want to know what I need to do this month. And so, again, it goes back to that idea that you need to cater these practices to fit the needs of your team, to fit the needs of your organization. Now, from there, in this case, with the natural resources group, we did an initial round of defining the problem, solutioning, and action planning. And we found that, okay, we've got an action plan for this initial round of solutions. Great. Let's go back and redefine other problems and do the same exact thing. So we got 2 rounds of prioritized solutions that they're working through as we speak. Now finally, again, that end result was that clear action plan. And so that action plan didn't just say, you need to do X by this date. It said, so-and-so is going to reach out to this person and accomplish this goal by this date. And to that end, a lot of these workshops had established communication plans. And so we worked with these groups and said, what's feasible? What makes sense in terms of communicating? Do you want to do a weekly call, a bi-weekly call? Do you want to do an agile stand-up? What works? And so creating that accountability made sure that this was very tangible and very real for the Park Service. All right, so just to close out very quickly, I want to share, regardless of what you've heard today, I want you to take away these 5 main points. So design thinking is as much of a mindset as it is a process. I think probably a lot of you are thinking right now, okay, this sounds awesome. How do I actually do this? How do I bring this back to my organization? And I'd say you become a design thinker the moment you start thinking more confidently and more consciously about your end users. So the moment you start doing a little bit extra user research, so saying, interviews aren't going to cut it. Let's do another focus group. Let's do another observation. Let's get that holistic picture. That's the moment that you start doing this in the right way. And so I'll add there that it again goes back to that idea of alignment and an idea of buy-in. Like any sort of process, it's very difficult to get people on your team to change in terms of their mindset. They're probably very used to doing things the way they are. If you can start small with something like user research or with exercises around defining a problem, you give your team that tangible thing that says, oh, design thinking works, and it works really well. Let's do this. Let's do more of this. Let's expand it. And so to that end, I'd say, yes, I've talked about design thinking today as a step-by-step process, but use this as scaffolding if and when you need it. So if you're struggling to define the challenge that you as KM practitioners are trying to focus on, do some activities that help you define the problem. If you need a little more structure around identifying those potential solutions, do a little work around ideating. Now, through all of this, the third point, don't underestimate the need for structure and clarity. Just because it has design in the title doesn't mean that it isn't strategic. I hope you've noticed throughout this presentation that there's a lot of prioritizing, of being strategic, of thinking objectively, and that is so critical to do this well. You can't just go about this process willy-nilly and expect it to work. It has to be very purposeful. Fourth, embrace not knowing the answer. This is so important, I think, and especially difficult when you're in KM. I can't count how many times I've been in one of these workshops with Park Service where I've had a million ideas running through my head of things that could work. But I'm not going to share that with the workshop participants, and that's very purposeful because they need to be the ones who come to the solution. They need to be the ones who design what they're going to do in the future, because if I tell them what to do, it's not going to stick. Now, finally, and most importantly, your end users are your partners, and I will be very short and sweet here and say that the moment you lose sight of their needs, their goals, their motivations, their frustrations, is the moment your initiative fails. And that is all there is to it. And with that, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I am happy to field a few questions, and as always, I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, so thank you. Great, so any questions? I know I covered a lot, and I probably moved more quickly than I should have. Any questions? All right. Well, in that case, I think I ran over, and I apologize that I kept you from your drink. Please forgive me. And with that, have a great night. Thank you.